Today I need to talk to you about a serious flaw in our education system, and I don't just mean here in the UK or in the US, I mean globally. Everyone's teaching maths, science, geography, but no one is teaching about our great and rich heritage. No schools are teaching the history of MMORPGs. So I've taken it upon myself to give you a brief history, and please take note of my use of the word brief. I'm not going to be listing every single MMO that ever existed in this video. I'm just going to give you a quick guide to where MMOs came from and how they've developed over the years. I hope you enjoy it. It may surprise you that for us to fully understand where MMOs came from, we have to go further back than the original EverQuest game. In fact, we probably have to go at least 20 years prior to the launch of EverQuest. This takes us back to the 1970s, when we first started to see multi-user dungeons come onto the scene. Multi-user dungeons, or MUDs for short, were actually just very simple text-based games. They were developed essentially by hobbyists, as they weren't even being developed on a commercial basis at this point, and they weren't even played over the internet. Now, this is obviously due to the fact that the internet didn't exist back then, which is kind of a limitation. However, they were played on smaller networks, the kind that you'd find at universities. In fact, the very first multi-user dungeon was created at the University of Essex in the UK, and apparently it was responsible for a lot of failed exams and MMO addiction. Of course, as with anything new and innovative, businesses eventually wanted to turn it into some kind of product, and this is when these MUDs started being developed on a commercial basis. And obviously at this point the internet still wasn't the place we know it as today, and these games were played over proprietary networks such as CompuServe. This meant that they were actually incredibly expensive to play, and often you even had to pay by the hour to play them. Now, this is quite a hard concept to get your head around for a modern gamer playing games like World of Warcraft. For example, if I had to pay for every hour I played World of Warcraft, I probably would have bankrupted the next 7 generations of my family. The whole theatre of the mind component of these games became less of a requirement with the release of the first graphical MMO. This was called Neverwinter Nights, and that's not to be confused with the 2002 game with the same title. As the 90s progressed, internet access became far less restrictive, and the genre started to take off on a far greater scale. The first really big title to hit the shelves was Ultima Online in 1997. This was actually the time at which the term MMORPG was first coined by Richard Garriott, the creator of the Ultima series. Things started to really heat up at this point, and Ultima peaked at around 250,000 subscribers. This is of course nothing in comparison to what we see nowadays, but bear in mind that gaming as a whole was far less mainstream back then. And not just gaming in fact, but internet usage too. So really, 250,000 subscribers was a pretty big deal at the time. 2 years later, a brand new IP turned up and quickly knocked Ultima from the top spot. This was EverQuest. EverQuest managed to pull in upwards of 450,000 subscribers at its peak, and is often credited as the game that defined the genre itself. People lost years of their lives to EverQuest, and many continue to play and enjoy it to this very day. The game set a new standard for what we expected from MMOs. The way that players interacted with each other, and the way that they needed to work together in order to accomplish sometimes even the simplest of goals, created one of the strongest online gaming communities you can imagine. Of course, EverQuest and Ultima were not the only two big titles of the late 90s. There were actually several others, but the one that would be criminal not to mention is Asheron's Call. This was another important title that helped to shape and define the genre, and it's considered to be one of the big 3 MMO titles of that era. After the success of these 3 games in particular, there was no going back. MMORPGs were poised to take the gaming world by storm, and it was only a matter of time. At the turn of the millennium, we saw a lot more MMO titles start to release. Developers were driven by the successes of Ultima, EverQuest and Asheron's Call, and were all hopeful that they could cash in on the next big title. Therefore, between 2000 and 2003, we saw the release of several games that were also significant contributors to the genre. Dark Age of Camelot launched in 2001 and is still talked about fondly to this very day. The game's large-scale PvP battles were revolutionary at the time and set the precedent for realm vs realm combat in later MMOs. We may even be about to see a spiritual successor to the game in the next year or so, with the currently in development Camelot Unchained. Interestingly, Camelot Unchained has actually been crowdfunded by fans, so the demand is clearly still there. During the very same year, Anarchy Online provided us with a break from the medieval fantasy of the 90s MMOs. The game was applauded by critics for its size and scope, though looking back it was perhaps a little ahead of the technology available at the time, and it wasn't a massive commercial success when compared to some of the other titles from that era. We also saw the release of some other big titles such as RuneScape, Ragnarok Online, EVE and Lineage during this period, and that's just to name a few. However, in 2004, the most significant event in MMO history occurred, and the genre exploded in a way that most had not thought possible. World of Warcraft hit the shelves in November and had brought in 5.5 million subscribers by the end of 2005, smashing all previous records. The game then went on to achieve around 12 million subscribers by the end of 2010. Many factors influenced the game's success. For starters, it made the MMO genre more accessible and easier to understand. Also, believe it or not, you didn't need to invest as much time as you did in previous titles in order to make progress. Additionally, the game had a strong IP and storyline that players had come to love when playing the Warcraft RTS series. So combine this with the fact that Blizzard were in a strong position financially after the success of their other games, and that previous MMO titles had started to bring the genre into the mainstream, and maybe we can go some way in explaining the game's success. Many of the old crowd weren't pleased with the apparent dumbing down of classic MMO features that we'd seen in earlier titles. However, to me it was a thing of near perfection, and I was just about the right age to start getting seriously involved. Honestly, Classic WoW is still probably the greatest gaming experience of my life so far. But we're not here to talk about my nostalgia. EverQuest 2 launched that same year, but many of the original EverQuest crowd were disappointed with the release. This, coupled with the fact that WoW totally eclipsed the game's launch and was stealing the vast majority of new MMO players, meant that EverQuest slowly started to fade into the background. The more recent cancellation of EverQuest Next seems to have put the final nail in the coffin for the series, but I'm still hopeful that someone will resurrect it with an awesome new title one day. Don't get me wrong, EverQuest 2 is still alive today and has seen some degree of success, but the days of EverQuest dominating the MMO market are long gone. Following WoW's success, we entered the era of the WoW clone. Everyone wanted a slice of the killer profits that Blizzard were making, and rather than trying to innovate and create the next big thing, many of them just decided to copy WoW's features, and basically just put them into a different universe with its own lore and perhaps a unique spin on a few minor features. And guess what? Unsurprisingly, it didn't work. Game after game crashed and burned during this era, businesses went into administration and no one managed to get a significant slice of that Warcraft money. The bottom line was, no one was going to beat WoW at their own game. They were too established, their game was too polished, and their players were too invested. The only games to survive that era were the ones that did things their own way. Sure, none of them have reached the heights that World of Warcraft has, but WoW is essentially an anomaly, and these games have achieved impressive levels of success by any other measure. The first of these games was Guild Wars, a game that saw great success by taking an alternative path to WoW, marketing itself as a more casual game that focused on its realm versus realm PvP aspects. Another big factor to influence the success of Guild Wars was the fact that the developers decided not to ask for a monthly subscription fee. Once you purchased the game, it was yours to play forever. This offered a nice option to players who wanted to get involved in MMOs but didn't want to pay monthly to do so. In 2007, Lord of the Rings Online hit the market, and it saw reasonable success. Much of this could be due to the fact that it was working from an incredibly strong IP. This essentially gave it a solid differentiator from WoW. However, I feel it would be unfair to claim that this was the only reason for the game's success, as it's still popular with a smaller group of players today and has seen multiple expansions positively received. Another strong IP that was unfortunately less successful was Warhammer Online, which released in 2008. This was a game that I was very excited about at launch. I love the Warhammer universe and I think the art style lends itself perfectly to an MMO. However, due to a steady and significant decrease in player numbers, when it came to renewing the license agreement with Games Workshop, the better option was to simply shut the game down. I guess we're going to have to keep waiting for our Warhammer MMO. Then, in 2010, we saw the absolute disaster of a release that was Final Fantasy XIV. Performance issues made the game almost unplayable, and it demanded a system that was out of most people's budget to even experience that. It wasn't long before servers closed, with developers stating that the game just didn't meet the high standards of the Final Fantasy series. However, the resources of Square Enix are vast, and they don't give up easily, and this disaster launch actually paved the way for one of the greatest comebacks in gaming history. More on that later. The next really big MMO release came in 2011 with Star Wars: The Old Republic. This was a game boasting an IP arguably stronger than any of the previous mentions. It's also the most expensive MMO ever made, costing an estimated $200 million to develop, which actually makes it not just the most expensive MMO, but also the third most expensive video game ever made. Number 1 and 2 are GTA 5 and Modern Warfare 2, if you were wondering. But despite this level of spending and a record-breaking launch, the game didn't turn out to be that popular, and it couldn't maintain its subscription model. It soon switched to a buy-to-play model with an optional subscription, and for a while this breathed a little new life into the game, but as of right now its player numbers have dwindled significantly. The game itself offers what I believe to be some of the best storytelling available in an MMO, but aside from that it's essentially another title that went down a route just a little bit too similar to Warcraft, and it just couldn't gain its share of the market. Moving on to the more recent launches that have actually been very successful. In 2012 we saw the launch of Guild Wars 2, and once again it proved that it could offer an alternative to World of Warcraft, rather than trying to be a direct competitor. Once again, it offered a buy-to-play model that did not require a subscription fee, and again we saw a focus on casual gameplay, though it is worth mentioning that some hardcore content does exist. To be honest, the results speak for themselves, and Guild Wars 2 maintains its position of one of the most popular MMOs to this day. The following year, we witnessed one of the greatest comebacks in gaming history. Final Fantasy XIV was relaunched as a realm Reborn. Square Enix never gave up on their dream of a Final Fantasy MMO, and they rebuilt the entire game from the ground up. This time it actually worked, so that was a positive start. However, it did far more than that, and it has become one of the most popular MMOs on the market, and is quite possibly only second to World of Warcraft itself, which is pretty impressive considering where they were in 2011. Then in 2014, the Elder Scrolls series took a stab at the MMO genre with the Elder Scrolls Online. And despite a pretty weak launch, it became one of the most successful games in the genre. As with the Guild Wars series, I believe that ESO owes its success to providing an alternative to WoW, rather than simply trying to clone it. The game offers a solid storyline, as you'd expect with an Elder Scrolls title, and it has its own unique twist on the traditional MMO combat system. It did actually launch with a subscription fee, but as with so many other titles, the developers soon realised that it wasn't sustainable, and now it's available as buy-to-play. Now something quite interesting started to happen around the 2012 to 2014 period, and that was the slow but noticeable decline of the World of Warcraft player base. It's important to note here that WoW is still the largest game in the category by far, and it's not even close to being dead. But it was always inevitable that players would start dropping off after a while, and maybe some were just done with WoW, or perhaps even done with MMOs in general. But a surprisingly large group was simply not happy with the direction that WoW had taken. They wanted it to go back to how it used to be, and at the time there weren't really any games offering an experience similar to classic WoW. So along came Wildstar, a game created by some of the ex-WoW developers that promised the hardcore experience that this group of players were craving. Sadly, they were unable to deliver on this, and the game didn't manage to gain the player base that they'd hoped for. It's still going, but it's essentially now supported by a fairly small group of dedicated players. So much for that dream. But after the recent announcement from Blizzard, we know that classic WoW is on its way. The next big launch, and to be honest, the last particularly significant launch in the West, was in 2016 with Black Desert Online. BDO is pretty unique in this list, as it's one of the few Eastern MMOs to see significant success in the West. Its blend of fast-paced action combat and deep skill systems has found the game a comfortable spot in the market. And that basically brings us to the current state of the MMO market. Right now, the only big developer that I'm aware of that's developing a brand new MMO is Amazon Game Studios. And right now, they're keeping their cards pretty close to their chest, so we don't have very much detail. And then, like I already said, we have Blizzard redeveloping the original World of Warcraft game, which will likely bring in millions of players, but we can't really call it a new MMO. So Amazon and classic WoW aside, there seems to be a reluctance from big developers to invest in new MMOs. And to be fair, who can blame them? They've just had a decade of trying to emulate WoW's success and mostly failing. However, the smaller studios haven't given up hope, and they're willing to build a game for a smaller group of players. These games might not provide mass appeal or bring in billions of dollars in revenue. However, they may just provide a subset of MMO players with their dream game. As I've said in other videos, I believe these studios are our best hope for seeing a new and innovative MMO, at least in the near future. In particular, I've got my eye on Pantheon, Rise of the Fallen, Chronicles of Valyria, Ashes of Creation, and Crowfall. I'm not going to go on about them here in this video, as this video has been about the history of MMOs, not the future. However, I have covered them all on my channel, so go and check out those videos if you're interested. I'll put the links in the description. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our little history lesson. I hope you enjoyed watching, as I found this one a lot of fun to make. I'd love to hear about some of your MMO history and experiences in the comments down below. If you liked the video, then please consider subscribing to my channel. I've also just set up a Patreon account if you want to be extra awesome and support me on there. The link is in the description down below. Either way, take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next video.